Thank you, thank you. Now, Ron, which button do I push to get my presentation back up?
Present your slide on your presentation.
I'm sorry? Play from start. Try that. Lovely, lovely. Yeah, it seems a shame to do a slideshow or a presentation slideshow. You can see how old I am. On Iceland and Iceland on a cold wintry night in Vermont. Next week I'll be in Ecuador bird watching, so a little bit different. And next year I hope to come back and give a talk on Ghana. I was in West Africa, Ghana, a couple months ago. One of the great experiences, if you've ever heard anybody that's been there, rainforests and canopy walkways and wonderful birds. We had a great experience. Photographs turned out really well, so I hope I'm invited back next year for a warm weather presentation rather than Iceland and Iceland. I wanted to make one comment. I went to a lecture last winter, I guess it was. Shirley Johnson, who's with the Chittenden County Audubon, gave a talk. And she had what I thought was a great idea of having the bird's name come up on the slide with the bird. Because if I say, you know, double-breasted cuckoo or something, and you forget that and you see the picture of it, but she had the name there, and I thought that was a great idea. So I've done that tonight. So I'm just curious what your response would be to that idea of having the bird name up there. It's not necessarily for my benefit, because I hope to remember all the names of the birds that I saw, but just for you, or that when you're looking at the bird, of course on birds in the Arctic, there are not so many unusual ones. There are gulls and there are alcids and things like that. So let's get started. We're going to talk about the incredible Iceland. This was a week-long midsummer trip that my wife and I took. This was a vacation trip with a little bird watching. The second trip was a 4-week dash, a 4-day dash in May 2018 to the Bering Beaufort Sea coast of Alaska for very much target birding. Now, you can bird a lot of different ways. I'm a life lister target birder. That's the most important. But as I travel, and maybe it's the older I get, the more I appreciate the other things that I see as I go along. So I'm going to share some of those experiences with you today. It's not just a series of birds with their names on it that you may or may not remember, but rather the whole experience that I have as I travel around the world. This was my 209th and 211th trip that I've made. So I did a lot of traveling when I was with McCormick, but I've enjoyed it very much. We're going to start with Iceland, and it's going to be mainly puffins and the auks. This is a wonderful family of birds. There are 24 different species in the puffin auk family. 6 of them have been recorded in Vermont, incredibly enough, which is really amazing. The alcids, puffins, and its conagers are found just in the northern hemisphere, and they pretty much ecologically replace the penguins, which are in the southern hemisphere. With one exception, one of the penguins actually comes into the northern hemisphere, the Galapagos penguin, which the equator goes right through the Galapagos, so that's one that comes in the northern hemisphere. We're going to go first to Iceland. As I mentioned, it was a family vacation. My wife and I went actually with some friends. It was a Lindblad National Geographic cruise, which we did to the Galapagos, and we enjoyed very, very much. This is the location of Iceland between North America and Europe, sort of off the east coast of Greenland. It's pretty far north, but actually not up to the Arctic Circle. The Arctic Circle is just on the northern part, just off the north shore of Iceland, so slightly further south. And the climate there is very interesting because of the Gulf Stream that comes up the eastern United States and goes over to Iceland. It has a climate that's very much like New York City in the winter. It's not an Arctic climate. It's not icebergs and that sort of thing. It's a very moderate, relatively moderate climate, at least for the physical location of the country. One of the most amazing things about the country of Iceland is the lack of vegetation, the lack of trees. It's a volcanic island. It sits right on the line, the rift line between the continental plates. So there's a lot of volcanic activity there, which has resulted in a very sterile and very moon-like look to the countryside. And this is fairly typical for what it looks like. As I researched this, I found out that before the Norse and the Vikings settled there in the late 1800s, or excuse me, the late 800s, that there actually were more trees there. A third of the island was covered with birch forest, which was chopped down very early on for firewood and other purposes. So there were some trees at one point in time. As I mentioned, this is a map of the world with those different plates and the areas where volcanic activity comes up, and Iceland very much benefits from that. Not always a benefit, sometimes it's a volcano that explodes and stops air traffic from flying over Iceland or things like that. But a very, very fascinating country. Our tour, Lindblad and National Geographic, had some wonderful lectures on board. We were on board a boat for a lot of the time, so we had lectures on the geography and the geology and the history and the culture of Iceland. It was a very wonderful trip, but very definitely this sets the tone for the kind of place that Iceland was. And for the first couple days that we were there, and we're acting more as tourists than bird watchers. Because of all the hot lava underground, there are a lot of steam springs. Most of the electricity and the heating that's done in Iceland is done from those thermal pools that comes up. And very, very near one of the main power plants is one of the most famous of the tourist places in Iceland. And I'd heard about this before I went. It's called the Blue Lagoon. And this is one of these volcanic hot water pools. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be really, really special. It turned out to be a great disappointment. It was a great disappointment because this is what it looked like. I had visions of this idyllic spot out in the middle of nowhere with cliffs coming down and sandbars or whatever. Lots going on. It was located just a couple hundred yards away from this power plant. So this is off in the background. This is us at the sign, and this is what it looked like. So very, very disappointing. The only good news is that after a long plane flight from Boston into Reykjavik, it was a chance to be in a nice, hot, sort of bubbly bathtub. So from that point of view, it really wasn't a waste of time. But if you hear about the Blue Lagoon and think it's going to be a wonderful tourist spot, it really was a disappointment. One of the things that we learned on this voyage was about the settlement of Iceland. Iceland was settled primarily by the Vikings in about 800 AD, so what, 1,200 years ago. As I did more research, I found out that the Vikings were not the first Europeans to settle there. The first Europeans to settle there were actually Irish monks that got in boats in Ireland in 700 AD and found their way to Iceland. Now, they didn't even know Iceland was there. Can you imagine a bunch of monks in Ireland saying, let's get on a boat and go find a new place to live? And they headed off toward the North Pole, toward Greenland, and found Iceland. So really an amazing story. But it was the Vikings that were the main people that settled there in about 860 AD. The Vikings were much wider spread than I ever thought. You think of the Vikings as from Norway or maybe Norway, Denmark. They got all the way down into the Black Sea. They got all the way down into the Mediterranean Sea. Their mainland was this area here in this light green color. Of course, southern Scandinavia. Denmark was a major area, the east coast of England. But they got very, very far, including in 1000 AD, all the way over to the Western Hemisphere. They beat Columbus by 498 years on getting to the Western Hemisphere. There are archaeological sites in northeastern Canada where the Vikings were there 1000 AD. So that was interesting to see. Still a lot of Vikings there. They're hard workers. This was Boris, and Goat. You can see the goat behind the desk there. He'll take the orders for you. This is a map of Iceland. The numbers there are the days that we were there. The first day in the lower left is Reykjavik. That's where the Blue Lagoon was. And the day 2 that you see there is by a geyser. And that was one of the tourist things that we went to see while we did a little bit of land. Then we got on the boat, and we had 3 days on the Viking cruise. The first day was on Flatty Island, where number 3 is in the Eider. And then we went up to Danvik, which is number 4, and then up to the far north coast on number 5. So it was a quick trip. But there are not so many birds. There are only about 40 different birds that you can see. If you went to Ecuador, next week I'll be in Ecuador, there are 1,800 bird species, so you wouldn't want to be there just for 3 days. You wouldn't have a chance to see even a portion of them. But you can see most of the birds and most of the sites in Iceland in a week-long trip. Very, very nice place to go to. Reykjavik is the capital city. It's about 150,000 people. Most of the people in Iceland live in this town. A very modern town, beautiful buildings. This is the hotel where we stayed. Very, very clean. They don't have so many immigrants from other parts of Europe. It's a very, very sort of unique culture there. A lot of the Norse or the Viking people are still there. Street scene, a little difficult to be there in the winter, I guess. This is how difficult it can be. That was a statue that we saw. But summertime is a great time to go. We went in July. Here in Vermont, July is one of the better months. We have a cabin or camp on Lake Champlain, so we hate to go away in the middle of the summer. But this was worth it to be up there at that time of the year with flowers growing, street performers, beautiful residential neighborhoods, very, very, well, should be European. It's in Europe. Very, very nice areas. And enough birds around just to make it interesting. I did not see any lifers, any new birds in Iceland. I didn't expect to. But we did get nice and close up to a large number of birds in the city park. Some of the birds, the gray-lag goose was right there. Tufted duck, another bird that you can see right here in Vermont, can't you, Ron? Not far away from here. Tufted ducks are recently found in Vermont. This is a molting mallard, fun to see mallards between the molting plumage and getting some of their head feathers back into. Lesser black-backed gull. This is an interesting bird because lesser black-backed gull is a European bird that breeds as far west in Europe as Iceland. And over the last 20 years, last 30 years, a large part of that population has begun to winter on the east coast of the United States. When I grew up in Maryland in the 1950s, 60s, 70s and was a bird watcher, lesser black-backed gulls had never been recorded in the Western Hemisphere. Now it's such a common bird that you can see in the Delaware Bay area dozens and dozens of them in a single day. It's really amazing. So maybe one of these birds we saw in Iceland will end up wintering in the United States, maybe even here. We see them here in Vermont. Reykjavik is a very modern city. This is the Opera House. It has a deep water harbor, so tour boats can get in there. It has excellent food. We had food at this restaurant called the Fish Company restaurant. It was one of the best meals I'd ever had in my life. It was so good that we went back the second day. And you know what happens when you go back to a restaurant the second day with the expectation of the meal you had the first day? I've never been happy except this restaurant. It was equally good the second day. So very, very good food. We're about ready to get on the boat, but we have one day on land to do what they call the Golden Tour. And if you look at an Iceland guidebook, you'll hear about this Golden Tour. You get on a bus, and in 3 different stops, you've seen most of the sites that you really have to see in Iceland. One of them is a national park, which is a crack in the earth where the earth's crack opens up, and you can see that. The next one is a geyser, the very first geyser that at least the Europeans ever saw, and a waterfall called Gullfoss Waterfalls. So you do that all in one day. One thing about Iceland today, unfortunately, is it becomes so popular that there's so many buses. Look at the buses in the parking lot. This is just for one tourist spot. You'll see a dozen buses. You'll see hundreds of people, many, many Chinese. The Chinese have a middle class now, and they travel all over the world. If any of you have been to Paris or you've been to New York City, the Chinese are everywhere. Half this group is probably Chinese. It's just amazing. The Chinese are wonderful people. I've been to China many times. I like Chinese, but they don't have the same social rules that we have. They butt in line. They don't listen to instructions, things like that. Very, very difficult really to have a nice time with the Chinese people. At any rate, lots of tourists there. This was some of the countryside. This again is the place where the earth is cracking and you get a lot of heat coming up in between and the earth goes wider and wider. And this is a place that really is right literally in the crack. It's just geographically one of the most amazing sights in the world to realize that the world in that place is coming apart, and this is the crack in the earth as a result of that. So that was a lot of fun. That was the first stop. The next stop was a place called Geyser. And geyser is actually an old Norse word that means gush, to gush out. It's one of the few Norse words that's actually in our vocabulary, but geyser comes from this Norse word, and this is where we are. So we get around the geyser and look at the pool, and then all of a sudden you see the bubble there, and the bubble gets higher, and look how close the people are. I mean, this isn't Old Faithful in Wyoming where, you know, you're a number of hundred yards away. You're right there, and this thing goes right up in front of you. It really was spectacular. So that was the middle of the day. The end of the day, we went to the waterfalls, and the waterfalls was spectacular as well. This is a wonderful sign. In the year 1907, the English came into Iceland and they wanted to harness this waterfall, I guess for hydroelectric purposes. And the local people that owned it did not sell it. They turned down the money. And it was really wonderful because it's turned into one of the great tourist spots in Iceland. You go there, it's like Niagara Falls and Iguazu Falls and a lot of falls, Victoria Falls. It goes over the cliff. It's just really, really spectacular. So we were so glad to see all these sights in one day. Beautiful waterfall. There are a number of waterfalls. We saw these 3 things on the Golden Circle tour. We only had 1 day on land, so we had to do it that way. On the way back, this beautiful little lake, a volcanic lake that's very, very famous. We saw lots of Icelandic ponies. Icelandic ponies have been there for over 1,000 years. The early Norse settlers brought these ponies in, and there's a breed called Icelandic breed of horses that has very, very thick fur. The fur is about double thickness of normal pony or horse fur. So it's a breed that's found just in Iceland. There's Josie with a very, very strong bodied, thick-boned horses with short necks and, again, very thick skin. A lot of tourist activity around these horseback riding. Instead of a ski slope like we'd have here in Vermont, they have a lot of horseback riding. We saw this horse show on our way back into Reykjavik. Notice the Icelandic sweaters. I see some sweaters in the audience tonight that look like they might be Icelandic sweaters. That really is something special there. One thing I learned there, my wife and I learned there, is that if you ever been in a horse barn and you see on the sides that the side of the wall is slanted toward the middle of the rink, have you ever noticed that? Instead of having a flat wall along the edge of a horseback ring, it slants into the ring a little bit. And I found that's because it keeps the horses, if the horses have something that they can rub you up against, if you're sitting on the horse and your leg is over on the side, they can rub you against a flat wall. But if it's a wall that sticks out, they can't do that. So up in Ferrisburg, there's a horse barn there, and I saw the same thing, but never knew the purpose for that. Okay, the second day we hop on the boat. This is a National Geographic Explorer, it's called. Really nice, good food, wonderful lectures, things like that. Very, very important. They have these boats that'll take you land in different places, offshore islands or different places. Very, very neat. The first spot was Flatty Island. There are 2 farm families that live on Flatty Island. Not much goes on there. There's this single chapel. And with only 2 families on the island, you wonder how many people come to church on Sunday. I think it's there for more historical value than anything else. There are some sheep on the island. There were some birds on the island. This is the Arctic tern. Arctic tern is known among bird watchers for having very, very short legs. These legs are much shorter than other terns, and it's a good way of identifying it, actually, if it's sitting down. Not often sitting, but bright red bill is another identification mark for the Arctic tern. This is the white wagtail. And I forgot to put the name. I told you I was going to have the name on each bird. Well, that'll start in a minute. I forgot these. The second day, we went to another place, this beautiful fjord land in the northwestern part of Iceland. Very, very spectacular. When you're there by yourself on a boat, there's no noise, there's nothing. We get off the boat, we take these little boats into shore. This is an area called Dinjandi, and Dinjandi is famous for a waterfall. It's been a protected area since 1918, and it says the name Dinjandi literally means thundering noise, so that's where the name for the waterfall. As you look back out of the bay, there is some habitat, some bird habitat, and I was able to get some pictures of the birds in Iceland. Again, if you went to Iceland, your trip list would come back with 35 or 40 species. That would be all that you see. And a lot of them birds similar, at least, to the ones here in the United States. This is the ringed plover that's close to our semi-palmated plover, but a different species. The oyster catcher, this is the Eurasian oyster catcher that looks just like our oyster catcher in the United States, but different species. The red shank sort of replaces our yellow legs. We call ours yellow legs, and they call theirs the red shank. There's the Arctic tern again. I finally got the names in there. I'm curious whether the names bother you, if they take your eye off, whatever, but I think in general it's going to end up good. This is the waterfall, and again, by being on land, by being on a boat, you don't have to unpack every day. All your meals are on boat. It's great. Then you take these little boats onto shore and get into these really exclusive places. This is a wonderful trip right to the top of the waterfall. We had a wonderful time there that day. Beautiful flowers and things growing. In Iceland, because there are no trees, you have to look very, very carefully to see the plants growing. I love this mushroom that I found along the way. On the third day, we get up to the very far northern part, northwestern part of Iceland. It was the middle of the summer, and they had a great party going on in one of the villages, a giant bonfire. Now, this is the land of the midnight sun, and even in July, the sun doesn't go down, so this was probably a party going on almost at midnight. But all the local people there, they had some rock and roll people having a wonderful time besides the fire. Again, look at those sweaters. I always like the Icelandic sweaters, and people in Iceland, they wear these sweaters. That's where the word Icelandic sweater came from, but it's not a made-up marketing ploy by some Madison Avenue advertising agency. It really is the sweater that the people in Iceland wear. The last day in Iceland was on Vigor Island, a small island, again, offshore. By being on a boat, we have access now by getting in the little small boats to go to these offshore islands, and Vigor was really a spectacular place. There were just a couple families on the island. They tried to make a life out of a couple different things. You'll see the two different things that they used to try to get income. Tourism has become a big part of their life, needless to say. All the tour trips that come there, they have a little restaurant there and a coffee shop, a tea room that they have. There's my wife in her Icelandic sweater as we land on the island with the flag of Iceland there in the background. We had a tour of the island. It was a walking tour, and as we went off with the walking tour, the fellow closest to us in the blue there, looks a little bit like Ron, maybe it's Ron's relative, gave us all sticks with red on the tip of the stick, and our first reaction was, why do we have these sticks? What are these sticks for? He says, you'll find out in a minute. And we went walking, and they were these Arctic terns were breeding on the ground, had their babies' nests on the ground. And as you got close, they would come and dive bomb you. And you really had to have the stick up to keep the terns from dive bombing you. And there's my wife trying to fend them off. And of course, I had to say, I'm not going to need one of those things. I don't need that. And you can see what happens. I mean, the tern comes down and literally attacks you and hits you on the head, sort of like a mockingbird. Well, maybe not so much in Vermont, but back in Baltimore, if you got near a mockingbird's nest, they would come often and hit you in the head. But this is the first time in a long time a bird has attacked me. Best known on the island for its puffins. They have many, many puffins, and you can walk right up to them. It's so wonderful. If you go to the Maine coast and you see puffins off in the distance, or in the winter, Lake Champlain, a bird flies by. Maybe it's a puffin if you're really lucky. But here on the island, they're right close to you, so it was really, really neat. Puffins are, again, part of the alcid family, that 23 different alcids in the world, 3 different puffins, and you're going to see all 3 of them tonight, actually. This is, of course, the Atlantic puffin, some of the fish that it eats. These larger alcids eat primarily fish. This was a fellow in the bottom that had been used when the artist did a mural in the church on the island that showed the people catching the puffins with nets. They catch the puffins and eat them. And it's one of the common foods in the summertime in Iceland. You can eat puffins. So this fellow here was showing off his white beard that was used when he was used in that artwork. This is the common eider. This is the other sort of summer business that you have. You have the puffins that provide a food source, and you have eider that provides eider down. And down is another word that comes from the Norse language. It means sort of a fluffy feather. We don't have very many words that come from the Norse language. The geyser word does, and now the down, eider down. But this is what the eider looks like. And that fluffy feathers that comes off. And what they do is they try to make it easy as possible for eiders to nest. They keep predators away in areas for the eiders to nest. And then 3 times during the nesting season, they go in and collect the eider down out of the nest. The female eiders are pulling this down out to provide a place for the eggs, and they go in on a reasonable basis and take that eider down out. So it's a very good business for them, and then they weigh it up and sell it in the international market. Another one of the alcids, the black guillemot. Another bird's actually on the Vermont list, very, very bright, or pretty colored bird, black and white with red bill and red feet, very, very common around the island. And again, you get very close to them. They're bringing food back to their young. Here's one with a red kind of a fish, another one with a silverfish. I'm not a fish guy, so I can't tell you what they are, but these are black guillemots. Different sandpipers. This is a purple sandpiper in breeding plumage. And then on the same rocks, this is a dunlin. We used to call it a redback sandpiper. If some of you started bird watching when I did 40, 50 years ago, we used to call this the redback sandpiper. Now it's called the dunlin. But the dunlin and the rock sandpiper, very, very closely related. They look a lot alike. The bill is slightly drooped, and you'd look at yourself and you say, how do you tell them apart? So I'm going to ask this group of bird watchers, how do you tell, what would be the easiest way to tell the purple sandpiper from the Dunlin? There's the Dunlin. There's the purple sandpiper, the Dunlin. The leg color, yeah, you see one with orange legs. It's going to be the purple sandpiper, the Dunlin with black legs. So if you know what to look for, it makes it a lot easier. Oyster catcher showed nicely, again, very, very tame on the island, the harbor seals. And then back on the boat, we're on our way back now to Reykjavik. The trip is over. I mean, we've had the land portion, we've had the 3 different stops that we're going to do. We did see some whales on the way back. These were humpback whales that we got very, very close to. And the people there studying them can tell them apart. They know which ones they've seen in previous years by the pattern of white on the underside of the tail. So there may be 200 humpback whales in Iceland, and they know which ones have been there before, how old they are. They keep track of them by photographing the amount splotching of white on the underside of the tail. As we went by boat, northern fulmar would fly by, parasitic jaeger, another bird. And then finally back into Reykjavik. This was probably close to midnight. Again, it's the land of the midnight sun. We're far enough north that even in July it's light most of the evening. And this was one of the most idyllic times that I've ever spent in my life. I'm out in nature a lot, and you feel close to God when you're bird watching or you're out in natural. But this morning that I was there, I was up on the deck by myself, complete silence, and just this beautiful look across the water and the clouds. I just felt like I was really close to God. Second part's going to be a little bit different. This is target birding. This is the birding that I really like to do. I went to Alaska for one purpose only, and that was to see this bird, the red-legged kittiwake. There are 54 different species of seagulls in the world, and I'd seen 53 of the 54. The only seagull that I had never seen was the red-legged kittiwake. So I set this trip up. I went to see my grandkids graduate from school out in California. I figured if I'm in California, I can get to Alaska quickly. So I took a 4-day trip to Alaska to see primarily the last of the world's seagulls. This is a range map of the red-legged kittiwake. This is Alaska, Russia, and the Pribilof Islands is really the headquarters for where this bird breeds. It doesn't wander far during the non-breeding season, so you almost have to be in the Bering Sea and be on the Pribilof Islands. I went to the Pribilofs because there were 4 possible lifers: red-legged kittiwake, red-faced cormorant, the horned puffin, and the crested auklet. And then I was going to take 1 day to Point Barrow to see the spectacled eider. These are the birds that I wanted to see. These are the places that I went. Over on the left, you can see 1, 2 are the Pribilof Islands in the Bering Sea. Number 3 is Point Barrow, as far north as you can get in North America. It's really very much far north of the Arctic Circle. And then back into the Anchorage area on the last day to see a mammal that I'd never seen, a moose. I live in Vermont. For 6 years I've lived in Vermont. I've never seen a wild moose, so that was on my list. So flying up there, very, very spectacular as you go into Anchorage in early June. Lots of snow on the mountains. This was the view out of the back of the hotel where I stayed near the airport. A lot of these airplanes that can go on the lakes and ponds and rivers, that's how a lot of the people get back into the interior, but often in the distance we could see mountains 30, 40 miles away, very spectacular. We got on a plane to fly out to the Pribilof Islands. It was about a 4-hour flight on a prop plane. It was going to be a long flight. Always wondering when you see something brand new, this is a travel advisory. Bear spray is prohibited. In Alaska, a lot of people take sort of like a mace spray with them, so if the bear attacks them, they can spray it. I mean, this is a common thing there, so you don't see that in Vermont, but I love signs like that. We flew out with bumped into a good friend of mine named Kevin Zimmer, who I'd birdwatched with in Brazil and in Peru and in Costa Rica before. He's a tour guide, a very good friend of mine, and he saved my butt. We got on the plane to fly out to the Pribilof Islands. We get an hour into the flight, and the captain comes on and says, we have to turn back to Anchorage. We can't go to the Pribilof Islands. They're having a problem with their air flight control system. We're going to have to go back to Anchorage. The flight's canceled for today. And then we said, well, what are we going to do? And he said, well, stand by tomorrow's flight. It's fully booked, but maybe you can get on tomorrow's flight. So all of a sudden, my flight is in big trouble. Well, Kevin Zimmer was leading a bird watching tour for VENT, Victor Emmanuel Nature Tours. He'd been there 32 years in a row, and he knew the president of the airline. He called the president of the airline, and they chartered a special plane for the VENT tour, which was 12 people, and me to join them because I knew Kevin. So Kevin saved me and we got out to the Pribilofs. It was a day late, but we got from Anchorage up here in the upper right all the way out into the Bering Sea, a fantastic place. Pribilof Island, called the Galapagos of the North. It's really a special place. It's run by the Aleut Indians. To get out there, it's very expensive. It takes at least $3,000 for 3 days because you fly out on the airplane line that's owned by the Aleut tribe. You stay in a hotel in parentheses, out on the island. You eat their food. You have their guides. They completely control the process. So wonderful place to go, but it's not cheap. St. Paul Island tour, Alaska's Pribilofs. This is Pribilof Island. It's hard to tell much from this picture. This is a low-lying tundra-like area where the fur seals come. They have almost 1 million fur seals that come to this part of the island during the summertime to breed. This is the airstrip. There's a fish factory, which is where the food service operation is for the tourists that come in here. And then along the west side of the island are cliffs where the seabirds breed. Cliffs where 2 million seabirds breed. Only maybe 8 or 10 different species, but 2 million seabirds are on the cliffs on the west end of the island. Very spectacular. As you go out there, you were assigned a guide, a personal guide. The fellow in the middle was from Chicago. He'd been hired by the Aleut Indians to be a guide. This was a couple from Minnesota that came with me. Since I wasn't on the birdwatching tour, I didn't go with my friend Kevin Zimmer and the group on the birdwatching tour. We had our own small group. It was very nice. This is the hotel. It's just a building out at the airport, very, very primitive. Welcome to St. Paul Island, population 438. Home of the world's largest population of northern fur seals, again, almost 1 million fur seals, and 203 species of birds on a little island in the middle of the Bering Sea. It's hard to believe. It was originally a Russian island. It was given to the United States or bought by the United States in the 1870s, the Alaska Purchase, but you can still see some remnants of that Russian culture out there. This was the fish factory, and we got off the plane. It was lunchtime, so we went down to the fish factory. It was actually closed in the summer. In the wintertime, it's bustling because of snow crabs and halibut. And they bring these products into this factory, and it's produced frozen and sent back to the United States mainland. But in the summertime, it's open primarily as a food service operation, a cafeteria just for the tour groups that come out there. So we got off and we start looking, and before we went in to eat lunch, I had seen all 4 of the birds I wanted to see. Yeah, all four of the target birds I wanted to see I had seen by the time I went in for lunch. They were flying by or sitting on the cliffs. They were right on the parking lot. It was really incredible. First group we saw were these little alcids related to penguins. On the left are called least auklets, and they are much smaller than dovekey. Dovekey is a small black and white alcid that we have here on the east coast of the United States. Breeds up in Greenland, but they're very, very small. The one on the right called the parakeet auklet. And then I took a picture and I came home and I looked at the picture and I saw this. And if you look at the bottom, I call it the spinhead auklet. This bird was twisting its head so quickly. This was 1/125th of a second exposure. And still, it's just a blur. It's incredible. And it's obviously an evolutionary ability of this thing to either look for prey or maybe predators when it's swimming in the ocean. It spends 11 months of the year swimming in the Pacific Ocean by itself, tiny little bird. So it needs to know when there's a predator around. So I think this quick turning of the head helps it survive. But I just was amazed when I didn't know at the time that this bird was spinning its head, but that was fun to see. Crested auklet was one of those target species that I wanted to see. We're right offshore. There were some mudflats nearby. We saw a lot of birds at the mudflats, including the red-legged kittiwake, which was the bird that I wanted to see the most. I didn't have to go very far to see my real target bird. Now I've seen all the world's 54 seagulls. My wife says, "Who cares?" Does anybody in this room care? Someone raise your hand. Okay, come on. Oh, that was fun. Now what do I do? Right now I'm trying to get to 300 hummingbirds. That's my next target, closing on that, so that'll be fun. One of the birds we saw, bar-tailed godwit, one of the great nature stories. You know, they put GPSs on these birds a couple years ago, and these birds that breed in Alaska winter in New Zealand and fly nonstop to New Zealand. They found out that they go nonstop, 7,000 miles in 7 days, 1,000 miles a day. Incredible, one of the great long-distance stories. Wonderful birds in breeding plumage. Long-tailed duck, we used to call them old squaw, a Vermont bird here in the winter. This looks like our Wilson snipe. but a recent split from the Wilson snipe. This is actually the Eurasian common snipe, which was one of the rare birds that we saw. One of the best things about the Pribilof Islands, a lot of bird watchers go there because the accidental Asian birds that arrive there during migration, and they'll get 20 or 30 different birds. We saw a bird called an eye-browed thrush that breeds in Siberia. It was one of the birds that we saw while we were there. The common snipe was another vagrant. That's a pintail. This is a Pacific golden plover, very pretty bird. Red phalarope, lots of red-necked, we used to call them northern phalarope, but red-necked phalarope. Interesting story about this bird, of course, is that the female is brighter color. It's the female there on the right and the male on the left. This is very different than most bird species where the males are prettier. I'm not sure evolutionarily how that happened, but it did. And then the habitat for the phalaropes. And another interesting thing about phalaropes is how they feed. It's a swimming shorebird, and they feed by spinning in circles and making a little whirlpool, and stuff comes up from the bottom, which they eat. And I got a series of pictures that it shows it. Not too bad. The bird on the left spinning to counterclockwise, and the birds on the right, I'll go back to the beginning. The birds on the right are spinning clockwise. See them spinning clockwise? And then they're picking up food that comes from the bottom. So that was pretty cool. I thought it was pretty cool. Sabine's gull, another bird that was flying by, was pretty. And then I went up to see the fur seals. And I was a little early for the fur seals. There are almost 1 million of them that will be on these beaches. And these are platforms where the local aleuts go. They harvest some of them, and also naturalists will go out there to try to count the number of fur seals. So these are observation platforms, but it was so early in the season that we only saw a single fur seal. Out of 1 million, only one had come back. But it was great to say that I had seen a fur seal on the Pribilof Islands. Some of the birds, snow bunting was great. Northern wheat ear for up in that part of the world, an accidental bird from Asia, a bird that we do get occasionally here in Vermont. Ron, have you seen it in Vermont? I've seen it a couple times in the last 5 or 6 years. But the main attraction for the Pribilof Islands are these wonderful cliffs on the far extreme west part of the island. And it's a recreational trail that goes along the top of the cliff. It's a cliff that drops off, many hundreds of feet. You don't want to get too close to the edge of it. But along this cliff are breeding 2 million seabirds. One of them is the harlequin duck, very, very pretty bird. But this is the real attraction, these birds that are out on the cliffs. In this picture, they're all thick-billed murres, which is one of the commoner large alcids. And in this picture are 2 different species of murres. Now, you're bird watchers, you did real good on the feet of the Dunlin and the purple sandpiper, the foot color. In this picture are thick-billed murres and common murres. What's the difference? Yeah, thick-bill's a little bit thicker, maybe. The white's pretty much the same, a little bit different about how it comes up in the front, but difficult. But color. One of them is black, and one of them is sort of a dark charcoal. So different color. The common is the brown one, and the thick-billed is the black one. Another thing that I never knew, I've seen different murres on the East Coast, and never used that as a field mark, but up there you can see how different that is. These, of course, are thick-billed murres with that dark plumage. Red-legged kittiwake a little bit closer. See, it has a very, very small bill. Besides being a small gull, it has a very, very small bill. This is a black-legged kittiwake. You see that larger yellow bill, and of course it has black legs. It didn't come out very well. The northern fulmar comes in 2 different color phases, the light phase and the dark phase. That's the dark phase. But you can tell it's in the petrel shearwater family because it has that apparatus on the top of its bill that allows it to take salt out of the water and be able to drink the water. Red-faced cormorant, that was a lifer. That was fun to see that. Well, puffins, what a great alcid. We've seen the puffins in Iceland, and now to go to Alaska a year later and to see them up close and personal that way again was really spectacular. It seems to be almost smiling. Doesn't that bird look like he's sort of smiling at you? And then the next bird was the horned puffin, very closely related to the Atlantic puffin. It's got a little bit more of a horn, different color bill, a little bit more yellow on the bill. Just a fascinating bird. And again, to get so close to these birds, where they're just as close as the front row of the audience tonight, just really spectacular. This is the light-phased northern fulmar. You saw the dark phase a couple slides ago. Lots of parakeet auklets. These ones, the third one had come in. I think there was a couple on the right, and they didn't like that guy. And they said, "Get away from here, get away from here." And off he went. And then I got close, and I read just today something interesting about these birds, because I saw this bill and I said, what in the world do they eat with a bill like that? We know that the puffins and the murres with the long bill, they're eating fish. You saw the picture of the black guillemot in Iceland with the fish in the bill and all that, and the puffin. What does a bird like that eat? And then you get up close and you say, oh my goodness, what does it eat? What does it eat with a bill? It eats plankton. I just read that and just learned that tonight. So it's fun when you put these programs together. You end up learning a lot that you can share with other people. But a lot of these smaller ducks don't, or smaller alcids don't go after the fish, but wildlife as small as plankton is what they eat. This is the gray-crowned rosy finch. There are a lot of species of birds. The rock sandpiper, the rosy finch, different subspecies than found elsewhere in the world. And someday maybe scientists will split this one out as a special species unique to the Pribilof Islands. But right now it's part of the gray-crowned rosy finch. Snow buntings, very few land birds, buntings, and those kinds of birds about it. Some caribou. Not native, because this is an island way offshore. They were brought out there by the Aleut Eskimos years ago. Some foxes there. And then back into Anchorage. And we came back into Anchorage, and I got back into Anchorage and had a short period of time. I figured, okay, well, I've got one day I'll go up to Point Barrow to find the spectacled eider. So I came back into the airport. McDonald's all over the world will have local things that they have on their menu, and this was the Denali Mac, which I thought was sort of neat. And then I saw a moose, and I said, the moose. That's the animal that I want to see. I haven't seen him in Vermont, and here he was right there in the airport. So I began to think about moose. So I went to hop on the flight there. It says Barrow. It's going to be 21 degrees and snowing. It's going to be really winter time. So I fly up there, and next to me on the seat is a local guy, and he's going along, and I'm telling him about the fact I'd never seen a moose. He says, you want to see a moose? He says, go to Kincaid Park in Anchorage. When you get back to Anchorage, there are moose all over the place. The moose come from the countryside to breed because there are no predators in town, and there are moose all over Anchorage. So I'm on my way up there. This was a wife of one of the people that works in the oil industry, and it says this about her husband. Yes, he's working. No, I don't know when he'll come home. Yes, we're still married. No, he's not imaginary. I mean, these poor wives that are in Anchorage and other places while their husbands are up in the north. So we land at Point Barrow. It's the Will Rogers Memorial Airport. Does anybody in the room ever heard of Will Rogers? Okay, a lot of people my age, okay, are almost that. Will Rogers. Why was this airport named after Will Rogers? There's Will Rogers. Well, it's something else that I learned when I traveled. He was an American cowboy, vaudeville performer. But in 1935, he was flying up the West Coast. He landed in a lagoon on his way to Barrow, and the plane crashed, and he died in a lagoon near Point Barrow. I never knew that. So in 1935, we lost Will Rogers. You see there up in the top, August 15th, 1935. The day he died in a pond, a lagoon, just short of the runway in Point Barrow, Alaska. So that's why the airport's named after him. This is the town of Point Barrow. This is the road that goes out to the northern tip. This is normally the Arctic Ocean, or the Beaufort Sea, it's called here. But because it was still so wintry, the sea was about 3 or 4 miles offshore, which made it bad for seeing spectacled eiders because there was no open water in Barrow where I was. And make a long story short, I missed seeing my target bird for Point Barrow. But it was a fascinating place to be. You can see the road signs here to different places, about 3,000 miles to the mainland United States, distance to different places. Learn a little bit about the culture, how the people lived out there. This is a place called Paglagavisi. Welcome to the ancient village. It says, the place where we hunt snowy owls. And this was an area, an archaeological area that talked about the way that the people there 2,000 years ago built their homes. The Eskimos didn't build these igloos out of ice. Maybe they did when they were out hunting on the road, you know, hunting polar bears or something. But in the villages, this is what they did. It was mainly underground. As you can see there, earthen walls, oil lamps, things like that, a tunnel-like entrance. They used whale bones to make the roof, the bones from the whales that they were catching. Today, the people there are a very, I don't know how to say this politely, the Eskimos up there make so much money because there's so much oil money, and the people there get sort of free money from the government. They get a kickback from the oil money that comes in there, and the people don't have to work. I guess that's the way to say it. So the Eskimos, the way, by our standards, it's really sort of crummy looking. You see some of the pelts of the animals that they're up on the roof. So instead of having an igloo or something that was more dramatic, you find these areas really pretty poor looking. The people themselves were not particularly friendly, the native people there. They kept to themselves. This was a sign on the house that you can't read from here, but I'm going to get a close-up to it. I mean, that was sort of the way that they felt about the foreigners that came in there, the out-of-towners that came up in there. This was their university. This is what their university looks like. I mean, compare that to Middlebury campus. This is the campus of the university. This is the theater building. Some of these probably World War II buildings that were left over when maybe this was a military base. Lots of polar bears around. There were lots of signs in the hotel about polar bears, and I saw lots of people scouting, some policemen out with binoculars, and I said, what are you looking for? Are you looking for spectacled eiders? No, I'm looking for polar bears, so be alert for polar bears. This was the road, the only road out to the point where I hope to see the spectacled eider, but no luck. Didn't see a polar bear. This was taken elsewhere, but that was one of the risky things. One of the few birds I did see was a glaucous gull picking at something it was eating. These are the whale bones that were used for the roofs of these old buildings. And if you look on top, carefully, there's a bird. One of the few birds I saw up there, the snow bunting. The Lapland longspurs were fighting for territory. That was sort of fun to see. Close-up of the Lapland longspur. White-fronted geese were coming back, but again, not much open water. The only eiders that I saw were offshore, flying by in flocks, a mile offshore, and got these pictures, but I couldn't find the spectacled eider. So of the target birds I wanted to get 5. I got 4, and then I missed the 5th one, but I got a bonus one on the Pribilof Islands, the McKay's bunting, which looks like the snow bunting I saw out there. So ended up with 5 birds. Another interesting cultural thing is the grocery stores up there. You figure, oh boy, you're north of the Arctic Circle, there's not going to be much in a grocery store. This is what the grocery stores look like. Watermelons, cantaloupes, McCormick spices of all types. I worked at McCormick, so I was interested to see that. For Real milkshakes, have those here in Vermont. One of my favorites, the For Real milkshake. I did have a For Real milkshake up there. And then fly back for the last day in Alaska and the end of the trip. This was what the tundra looks like when it's covered with snow. Almost looks like some sort of a painting, but this was the view out of the airplane of the tundra. And then flew over the Brooks Range and then down into Fairbanks. This is the pipeline that goes from Prudhoe Bay, where they do the oil that comes back into southern Alaska. You can see that oil pipeline through the countryside. And then back into Anchorage, and I've got a half a day. I'm there at noon, and my flight back home leaves at 8 o'clock at night. So I get in to rent a car, and I have in the back of my mind Kincaid Park, right? Kincaid Park, where the moose are. So I get into my car, and I drive down. I've got a little bit more time. I go down along the coast on the Seward Kodiak Highway. Very, very beautiful. Mountains that come right down. If you've ever been to Alaska, some of the cruises in the southern part of Alaska get into a lot of this kind of scenery, but it's the first time I'd seen it in the United States. Very, very spectacular. Water coming out of the side of the hill with these people filling up their water bottles with the well water coming out. And I'm on my way back up into those mountains because I've got some extra time. I want to just see the countryside. Another bear sign. Remember the bear spray at the airport? Well, this was another bear beware kind of a sign. If you see a bear, keep good distance from him. Well, I don't think anybody has to do that, but got up to the top again. A lot of Oriental people all over the world, both in Iceland and here in Alaska, taking pictures. But look at those fjords, the snow on the mountains, really spectacular countryside. It was just really great. Then on the way back into Anchorage, I still haven't seen the moose. But this is the Anchorage Wildlife Refuge, the mew gull or short-billed gull. Someday it'll be 3 different species, but right now it's lumped with the European mew gull. We used to call ours the short-billed gull. They were breeding there, some trumpeter swans, and I just a year before seen my lifer trumpeter swan right here in Vermont. So I go to Alaska and I see more trumpeter swans. That was the second time. And then all of a sudden, yes, maybe moose is a possibility. Moose next 2 miles. And there was Kincaid Park. I'm about a mile from the airport, and there's a sign for Kincaid Park. My hopes are high. I go in, and the first thing I see when I go in there is a giant moose. I mean, it was incredible. And if you've seen moose in Vermont, maybe you've seen them off in the countryside. I don't know if you've ever seen them up close. But this guy, we saw another one with a young one. And I've heard that if you get too close to them, they charge you. she charged me. I mean, I'm in a car, fortunately, but it was really one of the great experiences. Here I'm on a bird watching target trip, and my great experiences is this with this moose in Kincaid Park. So it was a wonderful way to end the trip. I always end a trip with an ice cream. And this has a happy ending too, because when I showed this trip, my wife was always saying, you shouldn't eat ice cream. It's got milk, it's got sugar, it's bad for you. I love ice cream. And at the end of each trip, I celebrate. So there I am celebrating mint chocolate chip ice cream. But if you look carefully on the wall in the background, there's a sign on the wall, and guess what it says? Look at this. Prevention Magazine. You've heard of Prevention Magazine? Our incredible new ice cream diet. Eat it every day and lose up to 30 pounds. Plus, fight cancer, lower breath. I took a picture of this and showed my wife. I won't tell you what she said. It's not repeatable in public. But she didn't believe that that was really Prevention Magazine. But at any rate.
Eider and the border on the picture before it. The border over there in the background above your head.
Oh, is that what that? I can't. I may have missed that one. I was so excited about the ice cream. What can I say? At any rate, so nice advice. Think twice. There's some ice. Go to the Arctic in the summer. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it. Any questions? Any questions? Pribilof, yeah, they run the airlines, the hotel, the food service. You have to have a guide out there, and since it's the only way to get out there is that way, it's $3,000 for 3 days and $5,000 for 5 days. And I have friends, I say, oh, you got to go to the Pribilofs, and I have enough that I can spend $1,000 to go out there because it's a lifelong trip. For a lot of people, for most people, for me, for most of my life, that would have been a trip I never would have gone on. So that sort of removes it, but it's so spectacular with those bird cliffs there in June and July, and if you're a lister, an ABA lister, the eye-browed thrush that we saw, the common snipe, and there were another 15 or 20 Eurasian birds that showed up there last summer right after I was there. So it's a great place for bird watching, very, very spectacular. So next year, if I'm invited back, Ghana, West Africa, the Canopy Walkway in Kakum Park, and out in the wild with the elephants and some really spectacular birds, including my favorite bird of the trip, the bearded barbet. So next year you'll see the picture of the bearded barbet, I hope. So thank you. Yeah.
So how many hummingbirds have you seen?
Oh, 287. 287 different hummingbirds. Yeah, it's a great family.
Yeah.
Lots of fun. And if you came last year, you saw, I think my program is called The Jewels of Ecuador with a lot of the hummingbirds photographs.
The names on the bottom is great.
Okay, yeah. I think that adds something to it because when I did the hummingbirds, you know, long-tailed so-and-so, and I say the name and then they see the bird and they have no idea what it is. But if the name is there, it gives them, I think, my audience, gives you folks a better chance. And me too, then I don't have to memorize all these different birds that I've seen. Okay, thank you all so much.